London, 1817. The Regency era pulsed with an elegance that masked the darkest secrets of England's most powerful families. In the grand Georgian mansions that lined Mayfair's prestigious squares, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors and silk-draped walls, the aristocracy maintained their carefully constructed facades of propriety and honor. Dr. Edmund Blackwood walked through the gas-lit streets of London's most exclusive district, his black leather medical bag gripping tightly in his weathered hands. At 32, he possessed the rare combination of surgical brilliance and unwavering discretion that made him the most sought-after physician among the nobility. His dark hair, streaked prematurely with silver from years of bearing witness to humanity's deepest sufferings, framed a face marked by both compassion and an increasingly troubled conscience. The cobblestones beneath his polished boots echoed his footsteps as he approached Ashworth House, a magnificent four-story mansion whose neoclassical facade commanded respect from all who passed. Tonight, like so many nights before, he had been summoned not for a common ailment, but for something far more delicate, another accident that required both his medical expertise and his absolute silence. Inside the opulent foyer, where imported Italian marble columns reached toward a ceiling painted with cherubs and mythological scenes, Edmund was greeted by Harrison, the elderly butler whose knowing eyes had witnessed 3 decades of Ashworth family secrets. The man's formal bow carried an weight of unspoken understanding. Tonight would be another test of the doctor's professional discretion. "His Grace awaits you in the blue drawing room, Dr. Blackwood," Harrison announced, his voice carrying the refined accent that marked him as a servant of the highest caliber. The blue drawing room was legendary among London's elite, its walls covered in silk damask the color of midnight, furnished with pieces crafted by England's most celebrated cabinetmakers, and adorned with portraits of Ashworth ancestors who had shaped the nation's destiny for generations. Edmund's trained eye immediately assessed the scene before him. Duke Theodore Ashworth, a man whose political influence stretched from Parliament to the Crown itself, sat rigidly in his favorite wingback chair, his usually impeccable appearance disheveled. His left sleeve bore telltale stains that Edmund recognized immediately, blood, but not from any ordinary wound. The Duke's graying temples were damp with perspiration, and his steel-blue eyes held a desperation that no amount of aristocratic training could fully conceal. "Another hunting accident, I presume?" Edmund inquired with practiced neutrality, setting his medical bag on the mahogany side table with deliberate precision. He had learned long ago that direct questions yielded better results than dancing around the obvious deceptions that seemed to plague this particular family. The Duke's laugh held no humor. "Indeed, Doctor. Most unfortunate. My horse became agitated during our evening ride through Hyde Park. I'm afraid I took quite a tumble." The rehearsed explanation rolled off his tongue with the ease of a man accustomed to crafting believable lies for public consumption. As Edmund began examining the wound, a deep gash across the Duke's forearm that showed clear signs of defensive injuries rather than any equestrian mishap, he couldn't ignore the familiar pattern. This was the 4th accident he had treated for the Ashworth family in the past 6 months. Each incident bore the same hallmarks: wounds that told stories of violence, fear-clouded eyes that spoke of deeper troubles, and always the insistence on absolute discretion. "You'll need several stitches, Your Grace," Edmund announced, retrieving his surgical instruments from their velvet-lined case. "The wound is deep enough to have damaged the muscle. You're fortunate it missed the major vessels." His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he prepared the silk thread and needle, tools of a trade that had brought him both acclaim and an increasingly heavy conscience. While working, Edmund found his attention drawn to the sounds emanating from the floors above: hushed voices, hurried footsteps, and the unmistakable sound of furniture being moved. The household staff seemed unusually active for such a late hour, their movements carrying an urgency that suggested something far more serious than their master's hunting accident. "Doctor," the Duke said quietly, his voice taking on a tone Edmund had heard too many times before, the voice of a man about to make a request that would test the boundaries of medical ethics. "I trust, as always, that tonight's consultation will remain strictly confidential." The family has always been most generous in acknowledging your discretion. Edmund's hands paused momentarily in their work. The generosity the Duke referenced had indeed been substantial, payments that far exceeded normal medical fees, gifts that included rare books for his personal library, and introductions to other wealthy families who required similar discretionary services. Yet with each envelope of gold coins, each expensive token of appreciation, Edmund felt the weight of his compromised principles growing heavier. "Of course, Your Grace," he replied, resuming his suturing with mechanical precision. "Patient confidentiality is the cornerstone of medical practice." The words felt like ash in his mouth, a ritual recitation that had lost all meaning through repetition. As he completed the final stitches, Edmund became aware of a presence in the doorway. Lady Catherine Ashworth stood silently observing, her ethereal beauty made even more striking by the concern etched across her delicate features. At 26, she possessed the kind of refined elegance that marked her as nobility from birth, golden hair arranged in the latest fashion, wearing a burgundy silk evening gown that spoke of Parisian sophistication, and carrying herself with the poise that came from years of deportment lessons and social training. Yet tonight, something in her emerald eyes suggested a vulnerability that her aristocratic training couldn't fully mask. Edmund found himself studying her face with the same clinical attention he applied to his patients, noting the slight tremor in her gloved hands, the way her breathing seemed carefully controlled, and the barely perceptible shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Father," she said, her voice carrying the musical quality that had made her one of London's most sought-after dinner companions, "I've instructed Mrs. Patterson to prepare your usual evening tonic. Perhaps Dr. Blackwood could recommend something for the pain." Her question seemed innocent enough, but Edmund detected an undercurrent of genuine concern that suggested her relationship with her father extended beyond the formal dynamics typical of aristocratic families. "That won't be necessary, my dear," the Duke replied, his tone softening considerably when addressing his daughter. "Dr. Blackwood's expertise has once again proven invaluable. I shall be quite recovered by morning." He rose from his chair with visible effort, testing the movement of his injured arm with careful precision. Edmund gathered his instruments, wiping each piece clean with meticulous care before returning them to their designated places in his medical bag. The ritual of packing his equipment had become a meditation of sorts, a way to process the moral compromises that seemed to define his professional life among London's elite families. "I'll return tomorrow evening to check the healing," he announced, though he suspected the Duke would prefer to avoid any follow-up visits that might draw additional attention to his accident. "Keep the wound clean and dry. Avoid any strenuous activity for at least a week." As he prepared to leave, Lady Catherine stepped forward, her movement graceful yet purposeful. "Dr. Blackwood, might I have a word? Privately?" Her request, while phrased as a question, carried the subtle authority of someone accustomed to having her wishes accommodated. The Duke's eyes sharpened, but he nodded his consent. "Of course, Catherine. I'm sure the good doctor can spare a few moments for your concerns." His words were carefully neutral, but Edmund sensed an undercurrent of tension that suggested this conversation had been anticipated. Lady Catherine led Edmund to the library, a magnificent room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge and culture. The scent of old parchment and beeswax candles created an atmosphere of scholarly contemplation, while moonlight streaming through tall windows cast intricate patterns across the Persian carpet. "Doctor," she began, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I must ask you about my father's condition. These accidents have become increasingly frequent, and I fear there's something more serious at work here." Her green eyes searched his face for any sign of understanding or acknowledgement. Edmund found himself caught between professional obligation and genuine concern for the young woman before him. Her question touched the very heart of his growing moral dilemma. How long could he continue treating symptoms while ignoring the obvious disease that was consuming this family from within? "Lady Catherine," he replied carefully, "your father's injuries, while serious, are not life-threatening. With proper care and rest, he should recover fully. The answer was technically truthful, yet he knew it addressed none of her real concerns. She moved closer, and he caught the subtle fragrance of jasmine that seemed to follow her like an elegant signature. "That's not what I'm asking, and I believe you know it." Her directness surprised him. Aristocratic women were trained from childhood to communicate through subtle implications rather than forthright statements. In that moment, Edmund realized that Lady Catherine possessed a keen intelligence that her social training couldn't fully suppress. She had observed the same patterns he had noted, drawn the same troubling conclusions, and was now seeking confirmation from the one person who might possess the truth her father seemed determined to hide. "My lady," he said finally, choosing his words with extreme care, "there are some matters that transcend the scope of medical practice. Your father is a complex man facing complex challenges. Perhaps it would be wise to focus on supporting his recovery rather than questioning its origins." Her expression shifted, disappointment mixing with frustration. "I see," she replied, her tone suggesting she understood far more than his careful words revealed. "Thank you for your time, doctor. And your discretion." As Edmund walked back through London's darkened streets toward his modest residence in Bloomsbury, he couldn't shake the image of Lady Catherine's searching eyes or the weight of her unspoken questions. Tonight had marked another compromise in his gradually eroding ethical foundation, but it had also introduced a new complication, the growing realization that his carefully maintained professional distance was beginning to crumble in the face of genuine human connection. The fog rolling in from the Thames seemed to mirror his own clouded judgment, obscuring familiar landmarks and creating shadows where none should exist. Behind him, Ashworth House stood like a monument to secrets and carefully constructed lies, while ahead lay his own uncertain future, a future increasingly defined by the knowledge he carried and the choices he would soon be forced to make. 3 weeks later, Edmund found himself once again walking the familiar path to Mayfair, though tonight his destination differed from his usual clandestine medical consultations. Lady Catherine had sent a formal invitation to attend an intimate dinner party at Ashworth House, an unexpected social gesture that had arrived via her personal maid along with a handwritten note expressing her desire for stimulating conversation among educated minds. The invitation had puzzled Edmund considerably. Physicians, while respected for their professional skills, rarely moved in the same social circles as dukes and their families. His background as the son of a country clergyman who had earned his medical degree through scholarship and determination marked him as distinctly outside the hereditary aristocracy that typically graced such gatherings. Yet as his carriage, a modest conveyance that seemed almost shabby compared to the elaborate equipages of other guests, approached the mansion's circular drive, Edmund found himself anticipating the evening with an excitement that surprised him. The prospect of seeing Lady Catherine in a social setting, free from the tension and secrecy that surrounded his medical visits, appealed to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Ashworth House had been transformed for the evening's entertainment. Every window blazed with warm candlelight, creating a welcoming beacon that drew London's elite like moths to an irresistible flame. Footmen in pristine livery directed arriving guests, while the main entrance had been adorned with elaborate floral arrangements featuring white orchids and pale pink roses, flowers that spoke of refined taste and considerable expense. Edmund's evening attire, while perfectly proper, marked him as belonging to the professional rather than leisured class. His black wool coat, though well tailored, lacked the subtle details that distinguished clothing crafted by London's most exclusive establishments. His necktie, tied with mathematical precision rather than fashionable flair, and his practical gold pocket watch, inherited from his physician father, completed an ensemble that announced his status as clearly as any formal introduction. Inside the mansion's grand foyer, he was greeted by Lady Catherine herself, an unusual honor that did not go unnoticed by other arriving guests. She wore an evening gown of sapphire silk that complemented her eyes perfectly, with pearl earrings that caught the light with every movement of her graceful head. Her hair had been arranged in an elaborate style that showcased both her natural beauty and her maid's considerable skill. "Dr. Blackwood," she said, extending her gloved hand in greeting, "how delightful that you could join us this evening. I do so hope you'll find the company stimulating." Her smile held a warmth that seemed to pierce through the formal politeness typical of such gatherings. "The pleasure is entirely mine, Lady Catherine," Edmund replied, bowing slightly as he took her offered hand. The brief contact, even through her silk gloves, sent an unexpected current of awareness through him, a reaction that caught him completely off guard. She led him into the drawing room, where approximately 20 guests had assembled for pre-dinner conversation. Edmund recognized several faces from London's social pages: Lord Pemberton, whose shipping interests had made him one of England's wealthiest men; Lady Fitzgerald, whose husband served as an advisor to the Prince Regent; and Mr. Reginald Hartwell, a rising member of Parliament whose political ambitions were matched only by his skill at social navigation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lady Catherine announced, her voice carrying easily across the room's conversation, "please allow me to introduce Dr. Edmund Blackwood, one of London's most skilled physicians. Dr. Blackwood has been most helpful to our family during Father's recent health concerns." The introduction was carefully crafted to acknowledge Edmund's professional accomplishments while subtly referencing his connection to the family without revealing any compromising details. Several guests approached him with genuine interest. The wealthy always appreciated having access to superior medical care, and Edmund's reputation for discretion had preceded him into this exclusive circle. Lord Pemberton, a robust man whose red face spoke of excellent living and frequent indulgence in port, clasped Edmund's hand with enthusiasm. "Dr. Blackwood. Capital to meet you, sir. My wife has been suffering from the most persistent headaches. Perhaps we might arrange a consultation." "Of course, Lord Pemberton," Edmund replied diplomatically. "I would be happy to discuss Lady Pemberton's symptoms at your convenience." As the evening progressed, Edmund found himself drawn into conversations that revealed the intricate web of relationships, rivalries, and alliances that defined London's high society. He learned that Mr. Hartwell harbored political ambitions that put him at odds with Duke Ashworth's more conservative views, that Lady Fitzgerald's marriage was rumored to be less than harmonious, and that Lord Pemberton's shipping empire faced challenges from new competitors with better connections to the crown. Yet throughout these social maneuvers, Edmund remained acutely aware of Lady Catherine's presence. She moved through her guests with practiced grace, ensuring everyone felt welcomed and engaged, while periodically catching his eye with glances that seemed to hold private meaning. Her social skills were formidable. She could discuss politics with the men, fashion with the ladies, and literature with anyone who showed interest, all while maintaining the perfect balance of intelligence and femininity that marked her as an ideal aristocratic hostess. Dinner was announced by the dignified Harrison, and guests processed into the formal dining room according to strict protocols of precedence. Edmund found himself seated between Mrs. Hartwell, a sharp-eyed woman whose conversation revealed considerable political acumen, and Miss Penelope Fitzgerald, Lady Fitzgerald's unmarried sister whose nervous disposition suggested she found such gatherings more trial than pleasure. The dining room itself was a masterpiece of aristocratic display. The mahogany table, large enough to seat 30 guests comfortably, had been set with china that bore the Ashworth family crest, crystal goblets that caught the light from 3 massive chandeliers, and silver service pieces that represented generations of accumulated wealth. Footmen moved silently between the chairs, ensuring that each course was served with perfect timing and precision. Duke Ashworth, who appeared to have recovered completely from his recent hunting accident, presided over the meal with the authority that came from a lifetime of command. Edmund noticed that the Duke's interactions with his daughter held a subtle tension, loving but cautious, as if he was constantly monitoring her words and expressions for signs of some unnamed concern. The conversation at dinner ranged from the latest political developments in Parliament to speculation about upcoming social events for the remainder of the season. Edmund contributed when appropriate, offering observations that demonstrated his education and intelligence without overstepping the boundaries of his social position. "Dr. Blackwood," Mrs. Hartwell said during the fish course, "I understand you studied at Edinburgh. Such a prestigious institution for medical education. Tell me, do you find London practice quite different from what you anticipated during your studies?" "Indeed, Mrs. Hartwell," Edmund replied thoughtfully. Edinburgh prepared me well for the scientific aspects of medicine, but London practice has taught me that healing often involves understanding the human heart as much as the human body. His answer was honest while remaining appropriately general. Lady Catherine, seated across the table, looked up at his words with an expression of intense interest. "How fascinating, Doctor. Do you find that your patients' emotional states significantly affect their physical recovery?" The question was innocent enough, yet Edmund sensed deeper layers of meaning. Was she asking about her father's condition? Or was this simply genuine intellectual curiosity from a woman whose education, while extensive, had been deliberately limited to subjects deemed appropriate for her gender and station? "Absolutely, Lady Catherine," he replied, maintaining eye contact perhaps a moment longer than strict propriety demanded. "Fear, worry, and unresolved emotional conflicts can manifest in very real physical symptoms. Conversely, patients who feel secure and supported often recover more quickly from serious injuries or illnesses." Duke Ashworth's fork paused midway to his mouth, and Edmund caught the sharp look he directed toward his daughter. The moment passed quickly, but it confirmed Edmund's growing suspicion that his observations had touched on something significant within the family's carefully guarded secrets. After dinner, the gentlemen retired to the Duke's study for brandy and cigars while the ladies withdrew to the music room for tea and refined conversation. The study, lined with first-edition books and featuring a massive fireplace, provided an intimate setting for the kind of political and business discussions that shaped England's future. "Dr. Blackwood," Duke Ashworth said, settling into his leather chair with a snifter of brandy that probably cost more than most people earned in a month, "I trust you're finding the evening enjoyable. Catherine mentioned that you have interests beyond medicine, literature, I believe." "Yes, Your Grace," Edmund replied, accepting his own glass with appropriate gratitude. "I find that reading helps maintain perspective on the human condition. Medicine tends to focus on specific ailments, while literature reveals the broader patterns of human experience." Mr. Hartwell, who had been listening to their exchange, leaned forward with interest. "Fascinating perspective, Doctor. Do you find parallels between your medical observations and literary insights about human nature?" The question opened an animated discussion about the intersection of science and humanities, during which Edmund demonstrated both his intellectual depth and his ability to engage with complex ideas. Several of the gentlemen expressed genuine respect for his thoughtful contributions, and Edmund realized that Lady Catherine's invitation had accomplished more than social inclusion. She had provided him with an opportunity to establish himself as more than merely a skilled tradesman. When the gentlemen rejoined the ladies in the music room, Edmund discovered that Lady Catherine had been entertaining her female guests with accomplished piano performances. Her interpretation of a Mozart sonata revealed both technical skill and genuine musical sensitivity, adding another dimension to his growing appreciation of her multifaceted character. "Dr. Blackwood," she said as he approached the piano, "do you perhaps play an instrument? I would be delighted to accompany you." "I'm afraid my musical abilities are quite limited, Lady Catherine," he replied with honest regret. "My education focused more on science than arts." "Perhaps you would turn pages for me then," she suggested, beginning the opening measures of a Bach piece. "I find that music often speaks truths that words cannot express." As Edmund stood beside her, watching her graceful fingers move across the keys while breathing in the subtle fragrance of jasmine that seemed to define her presence, he felt something shifting within him. The careful professional distance he had maintained was beginning to dissolve, replaced by something far more dangerous and infinitely more compelling. Their eyes met briefly as she paused between movements, and in that moment of suspended time, Edmund saw something in her expression that suggested she was experiencing a similar transformation. The air between them seemed charged with possibility, heavy with unspoken questions and undeniable attraction. The evening concluded with guests expressing their gratitude for a most enjoyable gathering, each departure accompanied by invitations to future social events and promises of continued acquaintance. Edmund found himself among the last to leave, partly due to polite conversation with other guests, but primarily because he was reluctant to end an evening that had opened unexpected doors to a world he had never imagined entering. "Dr. Blackwood," Lady Catherine said as he prepared to depart, "I do hope this evening won't be our last opportunity for such pleasant conversation. Perhaps you would honor me with your company for a ride in Hyde Park sometime soon. I find morning air quite beneficial for one's constitution." The invitation, while couched in terms of health and propriety, clearly transcended mere social politeness. Edmund found himself accepting before his rational mind could catalogue all the reasons why pursuing any kind of personal relationship with a duke's daughter represented professional suicide and social impossibility. "I would be honored, Lady Catherine," he replied, his voice steady despite the tumultuous emotions her invitation had triggered. As his carriage carried him home through London's gas-lit streets, Edmund reflected on the evening's revelations. He had entered Ashworth House as a physician summoned by professional necessity, but he was leaving as a man whose carefully ordered world had been fundamentally altered by the dangerous alchemy of attraction, intelligence, and possibility. Yet beneath his growing fascination with Lady Catherine lay the persistent awareness of the secrets he carried, knowledge about her family that could destroy the very foundations of the world she inhabited. The irony was not lost on him: the more he cared for her, the more dangerous his silence became, and the more impossible his situation grew. The fog that had become his constant companion during these nocturnal journeys seemed thicker tonight, obscuring not just the familiar landmarks of London, but the clear boundaries that had once defined his life and purpose. The morning air in Hyde Park carried the crisp promise of autumn as Edmund guided his hired horse along Rotten Row, the fashionable riding track where London's elite displayed both their equestrian skills and their finest morning attire. He had arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, the time Lady Catherine had suggested during their carefully worded exchange of notes, correspondence that had maintained perfect propriety while somehow conveying an intensity of feeling that surprised them both. Lady Catherine appeared exactly on schedule, riding a magnificent chestnut mare whose bloodline undoubtedly traced back to Arabia's finest breeding stables. Her riding habit, crafted from midnight blue velvet with military-inspired details, emphasized both her elegant figure and her accomplished horsemanship. The matching hat, adorned with a single white feather, framed her face in a way that made Edmund's careful composure falter momentarily. "Dr. Blackwood," she called, guiding her mount toward him with effortless grace, "what a perfect morning for a ride. I trust you slept well after our dinner party." Her question carried layers of meaning. Had he, like she, found sleep elusive due to the unexpected connection they had discovered? "Indeed, Lady Catherine," he replied, falling into step beside her as they began their circuit around the park. "Your hospitality was exceptional. I find myself still contemplating many of the evening's conversations." He hoped she would understand that their private exchanges had occupied his thoughts far more than the general social discourse. They rode in comfortable silence for several minutes, each acutely aware of the other's presence while maintaining the careful distance required by public scrutiny. Other riders dotted the paths, members of the ton taking their morning exercise under the watchful eyes of society's invisible monitors who ensured that reputations remained intact and proprieties observed. "Tell me about your family, Doctor," Lady Catherine said eventually, her voice carrying genuine interest rather than mere social politeness. "I confess I know little about your background beyond your professional accomplishments." Edmund considered his response carefully. His origins, while respectable, stood in stark contrast to her aristocratic lineage. "My father was a country physician in Yorkshire," he began, deciding that honesty served better than carefully crafted evasion. He believed that healing required both scientific knowledge and genuine compassion for human suffering. "My mother was the daughter of a village schoolmaster, a woman of considerable education despite her modest circumstances." "And what inspired you to pursue medicine in London rather than following your father's rural practice?" she asked, genuine curiosity evident in her expression. "I wanted to push the boundaries of medical knowledge," Edmund replied, his passion for his profession evident in his voice. Edinburgh offered opportunities to study the latest surgical techniques and anatomical discoveries. London provides access to cases and challenges that simply don't exist in country practice. Lady Catherine guided her horse toward a quieter path that meandered through groves of ancient oak trees, their golden leaves creating a canopy that filtered the morning sunlight into dancing patterns. The relative privacy allowed for more intimate conversation while still maintaining appropriate visibility for any casual observers. "I admire your dedication to learning," she said softly. "So many men of my acquaintance seem content with inherited positions and comfortable certainties. Your willingness to challenge yourself intellectually is refreshing." Her words carried a subtle criticism of the aristocratic men who surrounded her, individuals whose births had guaranteed their positions in society regardless of their personal merits or intellectual capacities. Edmund found himself wondering about the suitors who undoubtedly sought her hand in marriage, men whose bloodlines and fortunes made them suitable matches while their characters remained largely irrelevant. "And what of your own interests, Lady Catherine?" he asked, genuinely curious about the woman beneath the aristocratic title. Our brief conversation about literature suggested reading tastes that extend well beyond typical ladies' entertainment. A shadow crossed her features, so briefly that a less observant man might have missed it entirely. "My education has been comprehensive within certain boundaries," she replied carefully. "I read philosophy, history, and classical literature when my father permits. He believes that an educated woman makes a more interesting companion, though he draws distinct lines around what constitutes appropriate knowledge for someone of my station." Edmund sensed the frustration in her words, the intellectual hunger constrained by social expectations that limited women's education to accomplishments that enhanced their marriage prospects without challenging traditional power structures. He found himself wondering what thoughts and ideas she kept carefully hidden beneath her perfectly mannered exterior. They paused beside a small pond where ducks glided peacefully across the still water, creating gentle ripples that caught and scattered the sunlight. Other riders had chosen different paths, leaving them relatively alone in this secluded corner of the park, a privacy that felt both thrilling and dangerous. "Dr. Blackwood," Lady Catherine said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "may I speak candidly with you about a matter of some delicacy?" Edmund's pulse quickened, both from her proximity and from the serious tone that suggested she was about to breach the careful boundaries they had maintained. "Of course, Lady Catherine. You may speak freely." She dismounted gracefully, indicating that he should do the same. They walked their horses along the pond's edge, the sound of water lapping gently against the bank providing cover for their quiet conversation. "I've been observing you during your visits to our home," she began, her green eyes searching his face for any sign of discomfort with her directness. "You carry yourself like a man burdened by knowledge he wishes he didn't possess. My father's accidents, they're not what they appear to be, are they?" Edmund felt the familiar weight of professional ethics colliding with personal feeling. Here was the question he had dreaded yet somehow anticipated, the moment when Lady Catherine's intelligence and observation skills forced him to choose between professional discretion and honest communication with the woman who increasingly occupied his thoughts. "Lady Catherine," he replied slowly, "there are aspects of medical practice that require absolute confidentiality. Your father trusts me to treat his conditions without discussing them with others, even with family members who care deeply about his welfare." She stopped walking and turned to face him directly, her expression mixing frustration with something that looked remarkably like desperation. "I'm not asking you to betray medical confidence. I'm asking you to acknowledge what we both know, that my father is involved in something dangerous, something that threatens not just his physical well-being but potentially our entire family." The raw honesty in her voice caught Edmund completely off guard. This was not the politely indirect communication style typical of aristocratic women, but rather the direct plea of someone who had reached the limits of her ability to maintain proper appearances while watching her world slowly disintegrate. "Why do you believe that?" he asked carefully, neither confirming nor denying her suspicions. "Because I have eyes, Dr. Blackwood," she replied with a bitter laugh. "I see the fear in his behavior, the way he startles at unexpected sounds, the letters that arrive at odd hours and are immediately burned after reading. I noticed the new locks on his study door, the additional servants who look more like guards than footmen, and the way he refuses to attend social events where he might encounter certain members of Parliament. Her observations were disturbingly accurate, matching details that Edmund had noticed during his own visits to Ashworth House. Lady Catherine possessed a keen intelligence that had allowed her to piece together a picture that was uncomfortably close to the truth he had sworn to protect. Moreover, she continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, I see the way you look when you leave our house after treating him. You have the expression of a man who has witnessed something that challenges his fundamental beliefs about right and wrong. Edmund found himself staring into her eyes, mesmerized by the combination of vulnerability and determination he saw there. In that moment, he realized that Lady Catherine was not merely the sheltered aristocratic daughter he had initially assumed, but rather a woman of considerable insight and courage who was fighting to protect her family despite being deliberately excluded from information that might help her do so effectively. Lady Catherine, he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of secrets he could not share, there are situations in life where good people find themselves trapped between competing loyalties. Sometimes the desire to protect those we care about requires us to keep silent about truths that might ultimately cause more harm than good. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the golden flecks in her green eyes and count the freckles that no amount of fashionable powder could completely conceal. And sometimes, she replied softly, silence enables evil to flourish unchecked while good people suffer the consequences of willful ignorance. The words hung between them like a challenge, forcing Edmund to confront the moral implications of his continued complicity in whatever darkness surrounded the Ashworth family. He had told himself that his medical oath required discretion, but Lady Catherine's observation cut to the heart of his growing ethical crisis. At what point did professional silence become personal cowardice? If I were to speak hypothetically, he said carefully, his voice barely audible above the sound of water and distant traffic, what would you do with knowledge that could destroy your family's reputation and social position? I would use it to protect the people I love, she replied without hesitation. Better to face truth honestly than to pretend that ignorance provides safety. Edmund felt something fundamental shift in his chest, a recognition that this woman possessed a moral courage that shamed his own careful compromises. Here was someone willing to sacrifice comfort and security for the sake of principle, a character trait that both attracted and intimidated him. Lady Catherine, he said, reaching out to touch her gloved hand with a gesture that transcended mere social politeness, I fear that some truths are more dangerous than ignorance. There are forces at work in London society that operate beyond the reach of law or justice. She did not pull her hand away, and Edmund felt the warmth of her skin through the thin silk of her gloves. The physical connection seemed to open a channel of communication that went beyond words, carrying currents of attraction, trust, and shared recognition of the dangerous ground they were treading. Then perhaps, she said, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes, it's time for someone to stand against those forces, regardless of the personal cost. In that moment, Edmund realized that he was falling in love with Lady Catherine Ashworth, not just with her beauty or intelligence, but with the fundamental integrity that drove her to seek truth even when that truth threatened everything she had known and valued. The recognition terrified him, both because of the social impossibility of their potential union and because of the secrets that stood between them like an unbridgeable chasm. They stood in silence beside the peaceful pond, hands touching, hearts racing, while the weight of unspoken truths and impossible choices settled around them like the morning fog that still clung to the distant corners of Hyde Park. Other riders continued their circuits in the distance, oblivious to the drama playing out in this secluded corner where two people from different worlds wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. I should escort you home, Edmund said finally, though every fiber of his being resisted the necessity of ending this moment of unprecedented intimacy. Yes, Lady Catherine agreed, though she made no immediate move to remount her horse. Dr. Blackwood. Edmund, may I call you by your given name when we're alone? The request was so far beyond the bounds of proper social interaction that it should have shocked him. Instead, Edmund found himself deeply moved by her willingness to breach protocol in service of genuine human connection. "I would be honored, Catherine," he replied, using her name for the first time and finding that it felt perfectly natural on his tongue. They rode back toward Mayfair in companionable silence, each lost in contemplation of the conversation that had fundamentally altered their relationship. Edmund found himself acutely aware of Catherine's every movement, the way sunlight caught the golden highlights in her hair, the graceful confidence with which she controlled her spirited mount, and the occasional glances she directed toward him that seemed to hold promises of future conversations and deeper understanding. As they approached the familiar streets of her neighborhood, Edmund realized that their morning ride had crossed a line from which there would be no return. He was no longer simply Dr. Blackwood, the discreet physician who treated aristocratic ailments while maintaining professional distance. He had become Edmund, a man whose heart was increasingly entangled with a woman whose world stood in direct opposition to everything his growing knowledge about her family represented. The morning that had begun with the promise of pleasant social interaction had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous, a connection that threatened not just their individual futures, but the carefully constructed foundations of secrets and silence upon which London's most powerful families built their apparently unshakable dominance. The urgent summons arrived at Edmund's residence at 11:30 on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening, delivered by a breathless stable boy whose terror-stricken expression suggested something far more serious than the Duke's usual hunting accidents. The hastily scrawled note bore Catherine's handwriting, though the words seemed to tremble with barely controlled panic. "Come immediately. Father gravely injured. Catherine." Edmund gathered his medical bag with practiced efficiency, though his mind raced with possibilities that extended far beyond ordinary medical emergencies. 3 months had passed since their intimate conversation in Hyde Park, during which their relationship had deepened through carefully orchestrated encounters at social events, shared literary discussions, and stolen moments of private conversation that had revealed the profound compatibility of their minds and hearts. Yet throughout this period of growing intimacy, the shadow of Duke Ashworth's mysterious troubles had only darkened. Edmund had been summoned twice more for accidents, wounds that spoke increasingly of deliberate violence rather than mishaps, and a growing desperation in the Duke's demeanor that suggested his situation was rapidly spiraling beyond his control. The carriage ride through London's storm-lashed streets seemed to take forever, though Edmund's driver pushed their horses as hard as safety permitted. Rain drummed against the coach windows while lightning illuminated the Gothic architecture of London's most exclusive neighborhood in stark, dramatic bursts that seemed ominously appropriate for whatever awaited him at Ashworth House. Even before the carriage had fully stopped, Edmund could see that something was drastically wrong. Every window in the mansion blazed with light, an unprecedented display that suggested the entire household had been mobilized for crisis. Additional carriages crowded the circular drive, including what appeared to be official government vehicles whose presence implied involvement by authorities far beyond Edmund's medical expertise. Harrison met him at the door, the elderly butler's usually impeccable composure shattered by whatever horrors he had witnessed. "Dr. Blackwood, thank God you've come," he said, his voice trembling with barely controlled emotion. "His Grace is in the blue drawing room. Lady Catherine is with him. The situation is most grave." Edmund followed Harrison through corridors that seemed somehow different tonight. Shadows appeared deeper, familiar portraits seemed to watch with accusatory eyes, and the very air felt heavy with secrets finally demanding to be revealed. Voices could be heard from various rooms throughout the house, urgent, hushed conversations that spoke of damage control and crisis management. The blue drawing room had been transformed into a makeshift medical facility. Duke Ashworth lay unconscious on the settee, his face pale as death and his clothing stained with an alarming amount of blood. But Edmund's trained eye immediately recognized that these were not the defensive wounds he had treated before. These injuries bore the unmistakable marks of systematic torture. Catherine knelt beside her father, her evening gown stained with blood, her usually perfect coiffure disheveled from hours of desperate attention to his wounds. When she looked up at Edmund's entrance, he saw in her eyes a combination of relief at his arrival and horrified understanding of truths that could no longer be hidden or denied. "Edmund," she whispered, using his given name despite the presence of others in the room, a breach of protocol that spoke to her complete abandonment of social pretense in the face of crisis. Whoever did this, they wanted information. Father has been delirious, speaking of names and places I don't understand. Edmund immediately began his examination, noting the professional precision with which the Duke's injuries had been inflicted. These wounds were designed to extract information through pain while avoiding immediately fatal damage, the work of individuals with considerable expertise in the art of interrogation. "How long has he been unconscious?" Edmund asked, beginning the process of cleaning and assessing the wounds. "Perhaps 2 hours," Catherine replied, her voice steadier now that Edmund's presence provided both medical expertise and emotional support. "He was found in his study by Thomas, one of the footmen. The room had been thoroughly searched. Papers scattered, furniture overturned, the safe forced open." As Edmund worked, he became aware of other presences in the room. Lord Pemberton stood near the fireplace, his usually jovial demeanor replaced by grim concern. Mr. Hartwell paced nervously by the windows, periodically peering through the heavy curtains as if expecting unwelcome arrivals. Most significantly, a man Edmund didn't recognize, someone whose bearing suggested military or intelligence background, observed everything with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating threats and planning responses. "Dr. Blackwood," the stranger said, stepping forward with obvious authority, "I am Colonel Morrison from His Majesty's Special Investigation Division. I understand you have been treating Duke Ashworth for various ailments over recent months." The question carried implications that made Edmund's blood run cold. Government involvement suggested that whatever darkness surrounded the Ashworth family had reached levels that threatened national interests. His own position as the Duke's physician suddenly placed him at the center of a web of intrigue that extended far beyond medical practice. "I have provided medical care for His Grace's injuries," Edmund replied carefully, focusing on his patient while trying to process the ramifications of Colonel Morrison's presence. "Patient confidentiality prevents me from discussing specific details." "Dr. Blackwood," Colonel Morrison continued, his tone brooking no evasion, "Duke Ashworth has been under investigation for suspected treason. His medical treatment is now a matter of national security. I need to know everything about his condition, his behavior, and any conversations you might have overheard during your visits." Catherine gasped, her face going white as the full implications of Colonel Morrison's words struck her. "Treason?" she whispered. "That's impossible. My father is one of England's most loyal servants." Edmund found himself caught between competing loyalties that threatened to tear him apart. His medical oath demanded patient confidentiality, his growing love for Catherine required protecting her from painful truths, yet his duty as a British subject obligated him to cooperate with legitimate government investigations. "Colonel Morrison," Edmund said, his hands continuing their work on the Duke's wounds while his mind raced through the implications of revelation, "I will need some assurance of authority before I can discuss my patient's condition." Morrison produced official documents bearing the royal seal, papers that established his authority to investigate matters of treason and espionage. The weight of official government power settled over the room like a suffocating blanket, transforming what had been a private family crisis into an affair of state. Duke Ashworth's eyes fluttered open at that moment, his gaze initially unfocused before settling on the assembled faces surrounding him. When his gaze found Catherine, tears began streaming down his cheeks, tears that spoke of shame, regret, and the devastating knowledge that his carefully hidden secrets were about to destroy everything he had tried to protect. "Catherine," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "forgive me. I never intended, the debts, they offered a solution that seemed. God help me, what have I done?" Colonel Morrison stepped closer, his notebook ready to record whatever confession might emerge from the Duke's delirium. "Your Grace, you are under investigation for providing classified parliamentary information to French agents. We have evidence of payments, secret meetings, and intelligence that has already cost British lives." The words hit Catherine like physical blows. Edmund watched her face transform as understanding dawned. Her father, the man she had respected and loved, had betrayed their country for money. The accidents Edmund had been treating were the result of blackmail, threats, and violence from foreign agents who had trapped the Duke in a web of treachery from which he had been unable to escape. The debts, Duke Ashworth continued, his voice growing stronger as the pain medication Edmund had administered took effect, mother's medical bills, the estate mortgages, they offered so much money for such seemingly small information. Parliamentary schedules, committee memberships, vote predictions. I told myself it was harmless intelligence. But it escalated, Colonel Morrison stated rather than asked, his tone carrying the weight of investigation that had uncovered the full scope of the Duke's betrayal. Always more demands, the Duke confirmed, his eyes fixed on Catherine's horrified face. When I tried to stop, they threatened exposure, threatened you, Catherine. Tonight they wanted access to the Prime Minister's private correspondence. When I refused. He gestured weakly toward his tortured body. Edmund felt Catherine's hand grip his arm with desperate strength as the full horror of their situation became clear. Her father was a traitor whose actions had endangered not just their family, but the security of their nation. The love and respect she had felt for him lay in ruins, replaced by a nightmare of betrayal and shame that would define the rest of her life. Catherine, Duke Ashworth said, struggling to sit up despite his injuries, you must understand, everything I did was to protect you, to preserve your future. The estate was bankrupt, your dowry was gone. Without their money, you would have faced poverty and disgrace. So instead you chose treason and brought us infinitely greater disgrace, Catherine replied, her voice hollow with shocked disbelief. Father, how could you believe that betraying our country would protect anything I valued? Colonel Morrison consulted his notes, his expression grim. Your Grace, we have identified at least 12 instances where information you provided directly resulted in the compromise of British operations. 3 of our agents are confirmed dead as a result of intelligence you supplied to enemy operatives. The weight of blood on the Duke's hands settled over the room like a shroud. Edmund continued his medical work mechanically, but his mind struggled to process the magnitude of what had been revealed. The man he had been treating was not just a troubled aristocrat, but a traitor whose actions had cost lives and endangered their nation's security. What happens now? Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Colonel Morrison's expression softened slightly as he looked at her, a young woman whose world had just collapsed around her through no fault of her own. Your father will face trial for treason, Lady Catherine. The evidence is overwhelming. As for you, that depends largely on what you know about his activities and your willingness to cooperate with our investigation. I knew nothing, Catherine replied with absolute conviction. I suspected he was in some kind of trouble, but I never imagined this. Her voice broke on the final word, the full horror of her situation finally overwhelming her carefully maintained composure. Edmund finished treating the Duke's wounds, knowing that his medical care was now secondary to the larger forces that had been set in motion. Duke Ashworth would recover physically, only to face a trial that would likely end in his execution for treason. Catherine would survive, but her life as she had known it was over, her family name would be forever associated with betrayal, her social position destroyed, her future prospects obliterated. Dr. Blackwood, Colonel Morrison said, I'll need a complete report on the Duke's condition and a detailed account of every conversation you had with him during your treatments. Your testimony will be crucial in establishing the timeline of his treasonous activities. Edmund nodded, understanding that his own careful silence had made him an unwitting accessory to events far beyond his comprehension. The moral complexity of his position now seemed almost trivial compared to the life-and-death consequences of the Duke's choices. As the rain continued to lash against the windows of Ashworth House, Edmund realized that this night marked the end of one world and the beginning of another, a future where the woman he loved would face social destruction while carrying the burden of her father's betrayal, and where his own role as keeper of aristocratic secrets had evolved into something far more dangerous and morally ambiguous than he had ever imagined possible. The blue drawing room, once a symbol of aristocratic elegance and power, had become the setting for revelations that would reshape lives, destroy reputations, and force everyone present to confront the terrible price of choices made in desperation and moral compromise. Dawn broke grey and unforgiving over London as Edmund walked through the empty streets toward his Bloomsbury residence, his mind reeling from the events of the previous night. The rain had stopped, but the city seemed washed clean of its familiar comfort, leaving behind a stark landscape where nothing could be taken for granted and every assumption had been revealed as dangerously naive. In his coat pocket lay a letter from Catherine, pressed into his hands as he left Ashworth House under the watchful eyes of Colonel Morrison's men. He had not yet found the courage to read it, knowing that her words would force him to confront decisions he was not prepared to make. The weight of the sealed envelope seemed to grow heavier with each step, carrying the promise of either salvation or final destruction of any hope for their future together. His modest home on Bedford Square had never seemed so isolated from the grand mansions of Mayfair, yet today that distance felt like a protective barrier rather than a mark of social inadequacy. Here, surrounded by his medical books and simple furnishings, Edmund could temporarily escape the nightmare of aristocratic intrigue that had consumed his life over the past months. He finally opened Catherine's letter as morning light streamed through his study windows, illuminating her familiar handwriting, script that had once brought him joy but now carried the weight of impending tragedy. "My dearest Edmund," the letter began, and even those 3 words carried a profound sadness that made his heart ache. "By the time you read this, you will know the full extent of my father's betrayal and the destruction it has brought upon our family. I write not to burden you with my sorrow, but to release you from any obligation you might feel toward someone whose name will soon be synonymous with treason and disgrace." Edmund's hands trembled as he continued reading, each word revealing the depth of Catherine's pain and the strength of character that made her consider his reputation before her own desperate need for support and comfort. "I have spent the night contemplating the choices before me," the letter continued. "I can remain in London and face the whispers, the social ostracism, and the constant reminder of my father's shame. Or I can leave England entirely, perhaps for the American colonies, where the Ashworth name carries no weight and I might build a life free from the shadow of his betrayal." The prospect of Catherine leaving England struck Edmund like a physical blow. The woman who had become the center of his emotional world, whose intelligence and courage had challenged him to become a better man, might disappear forever rather than drag others down with her family's disgrace. "Whatever I choose," the letter concluded, "I want you to know that our conversations, our stolen moments of intimacy, and your unwavering integrity have been the brightest lights in what has become a very dark time. Please remember me as I was during our rides in Hyde Park, not as the daughter of a traitor who will forever carry the stain of his choices." The letter was signed simply, Catherine, without her title, a detail that spoke volumes about how completely her world had changed overnight. Edmund set the paper aside and stared out his window at the awakening city, wrestling with emotions and choices that seemed to offer no satisfactory resolution. A knock at his door interrupted his contemplation. Edmund opened it to find Colonel Morrison, looking haggard from his long night but still carrying the air of official authority that had dominated the previous evening's revelations. "Dr. Blackwood," Morrison said, "I apologize for the early hour, but circumstances require immediate action. May I come in?" Edmund gestured him into the study, noting that Morrison's demeanor suggested developments that went beyond the previous night's confessions. The colonel's presence in his modest home brought the weight of government authority into Edmund's private sanctuary, reminding him that his involvement in the Ashworth affair was far from over. "Dr. Blackwood," Morrison began, settling into Edmund's reading chair with obvious fatigue, "Duke Ashworth's condition has deteriorated during the night. He's developed a fever and is becoming increasingly delirious. We need your medical expertise to keep him stable until his trial." "What do you mean by deteriorated?" Edmund asked, his professional instincts overriding his personal turmoil. "The wounds you treated last night have become infected. Our physician believes he may have been poisoned as well, something designed to appear natural while ensuring he won't survive to provide details about his French contacts." Morrison's expression was grim. We need him alive, Doctor. His testimony is crucial for identifying the entire spy network. Edmund felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. Duke Ashworth was a traitor whose actions had cost British lives, yet he was also Catherine's father and Edmund's patient. Medical ethics demanded that Edmund provide the best possible care regardless of personal feelings about the patient's character or crimes. "I'll need access to my full medical supplies," Edmund said, already reaching for his coat. "And I'll require complete authority over his treatment, without interference from your investigation." "Agreed," Morrison replied immediately. "Dr. Blackwood, there's something else you should know. Lady Catherine has requested permission to visit her father before the trial proceedings begin. We're inclined to grant her request, but we need someone present who can monitor the conversation and ensure no information is passed that might compromise our investigation." The request placed Edmund in yet another ethically impossible position. Morrison was asking him to spy on the woman he loved during what might be her final conversation with her dying father. Yet refusal might mean that Catherine would be denied this crucial goodbye, leaving her with even greater regrets and unresolved grief. "Colonel Morrison," Edmund said carefully, "I understand the security concerns, but Lady Catherine deserves some privacy during what may be her father's final hours. Perhaps I could be present in a medical capacity while ensuring that no sensitive information is discussed." Morrison considered this proposal, clearly weighing security requirements against basic human compassion. "Very well, Doctor. But any attempt to pass information or coordinate stories will result in immediate intervention, regardless of the personal relationships involved." They traveled together back to Ashworth House, where the morning light revealed the full extent of the previous night's transformation. Government guards had replaced the family's regular servants, official seals marked rooms that were now considered evidence, and the entire mansion had taken on the sterile atmosphere of a crime scene rather than a family home. Catherine awaited them in the morning room, dressed in simple black clothing that emphasized both her grief and her determination to face whatever ordeals lay ahead. She had spent the night at her father's bedside, and exhaustion was evident in her pale complexion and the dark circles beneath her eyes. Yet her posture remained erect, her voice steady, as she greeted Edmund with formal politeness that masked the deeper emotions visible only to someone who knew her intimately. "Dr. Blackwood," she said, "thank you for coming. Father's condition has worsened considerably since you left last night." Edmund examined the Duke, finding Morrison's assessment accurate. The wounds had indeed become severely infected, and symptoms suggested possible poisoning designed to mimic natural complications from his injuries. The irony was bitter. The same French agents who had used Duke Ashworth for their purposes were now attempting to silence him permanently. "I can treat the infection," Edmund told Morrison and Catherine, "but if he has been poisoned, recovery will depend on identifying the specific toxin and administering appropriate antidotes. This will require time and resources that may not be available." "Do whatever is necessary," Morrison instructed. "The Duke's testimony is worth more than any expense." As Edmund began treatment, Catherine remained close to her father's bedside, speaking to him in gentle tones that revealed the deep affection that had always characterized their relationship despite the devastating revelations of his betrayal. Edmund found himself moved by her loyalty and compassion, emotions that transcended her father's crimes and spoke to fundamental qualities of character that made her remarkable among the often shallow members of her social class. "Father," Catherine said softly, "if you can hear me, I want you to know that I understand why you made the choices you did. I don't agree with them, and I can't pretend they haven't destroyed our family, but I know they came from a desire to protect me." Duke Ashworth's eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty on his daughter's face. "Catherine," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "I have destroyed everything you should have inherited. Your mother's memory, our family's honor, your future prospects, all gone because of my weakness." "We'll face whatever comes," Catherine replied, taking his hand with gentle firmness. "But first, you must recover your strength. Dr. Blackwood says you can survive this if you fight." The Duke's gaze shifted to Edmund, recognition dawning in his fever-bright eyes. "Doctor," he said with obvious effort, "you have been, more than a physician to this family. Promise me, whatever happens to me, you'll help Catherine build a new life." The request placed Edmund in an impossible position, asking him to make promises about a future that remained utterly uncertain. Yet looking at Catherine's face, seeing the desperate hope in her eyes, Edmund found himself nodding agreement to a commitment that might well be beyond his power to fulfill. "Your Grace," he replied formally, aware that Morrison was listening to every word, "I will do everything possible to ensure Lady Catherine's welfare." Over the following hours, Edmund worked tirelessly to stabilize the Duke's condition while Catherine maintained her vigil beside his bed. Their presence together created an intimate atmosphere that transcended the formal constraints Morrison's investigation had imposed, allowing them moments of quiet conversation that revealed the depth of their mutual support and understanding. "Edmund," Catherine said during one of these quiet interludes, "I've made my decision about leaving England. I cannot remain here and watch my father face execution while society whispers about our family's disgrace. I have distant relatives in Virginia who might provide a fresh start." The confirmation of his worst fears hit Edmund like a physical blow, yet he understood the logic behind her choice. Remaining in England would mean a lifetime of social ostracism and constant reminders of her father's betrayal, a fate that would slowly destroy someone with her pride and sensitivity. "When would you leave?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral despite the emotional turmoil her decision had triggered. "As soon as father's situation is resolved," she replied, her careful choice of words acknowledging that Duke Ashworth's trial would likely end in his execution. "I have enough personal funds for passage and basic establishment in the colonies." Edmund found himself facing the most crucial decision of his life. He could accept Catherine's departure, allow her to disappear from his life forever while he returned to his comfortable but emotionally sterile existence as a society physician. Or he could take the enormous risk of following her to America, abandoning his established practice and social position for the uncertain prospect of building a new life in a foreign land with the woman he loved. The choice seemed impossible, yet as Edmund looked at Catherine's face, seeing the courage and determination that had first attracted him to her, he realized that no future worth having could be built on the foundation of safety and compromise that had characterized his life thus far. The afternoon light streaming through the windows of Ashworth House illuminated a scene that perfectly captured the complexity of their situation: a dying traitor seeking redemption, a loyal daughter facing social destruction, a physician wrestling with the choice between professional security and personal integrity, and love attempting to survive in the wreckage of a world built on secrets and lies. 3 weeks later, Edmund stood on the deck of the merchant ship, Britannia's Dream, as it prepared to depart from Portsmouth Harbor, watching the English coastline recede into the grey morning mist. Beside him, Catherine gripped the railing with hands that trembled slightly, whether from the ship's movement or the magnitude of their shared decision to abandon everything familiar for an uncertain future in America. The events following Duke Ashworth's death had unfolded with the inexorable progression of a Greek tragedy. Despite Edmund's best medical efforts, the Duke had succumbed to the combination of his injuries and the slow-acting poison his former French contacts had administered to ensure his permanent silence. His death had robbed Colonel Morrison's investigation of crucial testimony, but it had also freed Catherine from the agony of watching her father face public trial and execution. The Duke's funeral had been a private affair, attended only by Catherine, Edmund, and a handful of servants who had remained loyal despite the family's disgrace. No other members of London society had dared associate themselves with the Ashworth name, and the church had only grudgingly allowed burial in consecrated ground after considerable negotiation and financial consideration. Yet in death, Duke Ashworth had achieved a final act of redemption that partially absolved his betrayal. Hidden in his private papers, investigators had discovered detailed records of his French contacts, meeting locations, and the complete structure of the spy network that had entrapped him. This information, combined with his dying confession to Colonel Morrison, had enabled British intelligence to roll up the entire operation and arrest 17 enemy agents operating throughout England. "He found a way to restore some honor to our family name," Catherine had told Edmund after learning of her father's posthumous contribution to national security. "It doesn't excuse his betrayal, but it gives meaning to his death." Edmund's decision to abandon his London practice and accompany Catherine to America had surprised everyone who knew him, colleagues who considered him one of the city's most promising young physicians, patients who had relied on his skill and discretion, and society figures who had valued his professional services. Yet the choice had felt inevitable once he acknowledged that his future happiness was impossible without the woman whose courage and integrity had transformed his understanding of what truly mattered in life. The practical arrangements for their departure had required careful planning and considerable sacrifice. Edmund had sold his modest house and most of his possessions, keeping only his medical books and instruments, the tools that would allow him to establish a practice in the New World. Catherine had liquidated her personal jewelry and remaining assets, providing sufficient funds for their passage and initial establishment in Virginia. Their relationship had evolved during those final weeks in England from secret attachment to open partnership, though they had maintained proper social forms until her father's death made such concerns irrelevant. Edmund had formally requested permission to court Catherine from Colonel Morrison, who had served as her temporary guardian during the investigation's conclusion, a request that had been granted with bemused approval from a man who had witnessed their devotion during the Duke's final days. Now, as the ship cleared Portsmouth harbor and began its journey across the Atlantic, Catherine turned to Edmund with an expression that mixed grief for what they were leaving behind with hope for what they might build together. "No regrets?" she asked, her voice carrying genuine concern that his sacrifice might prove too great to bear. "None whatsoever," Edmund replied, taking her hand in his as they watched England disappear into the horizon. "I've spent my entire life treating symptoms while ignoring underlying diseases. Perhaps it's time I learned to focus on healing rather than merely managing problems." Their passage to America would take 6 weeks, providing time for long conversations about their hopes and plans for their new life. Catherine had corresponded with her distant cousins in Virginia, who had agreed to sponsor their initial settlement in exchange for Edmund's medical services to their rural community. The prospect of frontier medicine appealed to Edmund's sense of adventure and his desire to practice healing based on genuine need rather than social obligation. During the voyage, they spent hours walking the deck, sharing stories of their childhoods, their dreams, and their observations about the aristocratic world they had left behind. Catherine revealed the intellectual curiosity that her social training had forced her to conceal, discussing philosophy, politics, and literature with a freedom impossible in London's rigid social hierarchy. Edmund discovered depths of wit and wisdom that made her even more attractive than her physical beauty had initially suggested. "I realize now," Catherine said one evening as they watched the sunset paint the ocean in brilliant oranges and purples, "that my entire life in England was spent performing a role rather than being myself. The constant attention to propriety, the careful management of every word and gesture, the pretense that intellect was less important than accomplishment, I never understood how exhausting it was until I was free from it." "And I," Edmund replied, "spent my career enabling the very corruption that ultimately destroyed your family. I told myself that discretion was professional virtue, but really it was moral cowardice. I was more concerned with protecting my position than protecting the truth." Their conversations gradually evolved from reflection on their past mistakes to planning for their future possibilities. Edmund would establish a medical practice serving Virginia's growing population of settlers and farmers, people whose needs would be straightforward and whose gratitude would be genuine rather than calculated. Catherine would be free to pursue her intellectual interests, perhaps establishing a school for the children of their community, a possibility that excited her more than any of the social activities that had filled her London days. Most importantly, they would build their relationship on foundations of honesty and mutual respect rather than the social conventions that had dictated aristocratic marriages. Their shared experience of moral crisis had revealed character traits that went far beyond surface attractions, creating a bond based on genuine compatibility of values and aspirations. As their ship approached the American coast after 5 weeks at sea, Edmund and Catherine stood together at the bow, watching the unfamiliar shoreline emerge from the morning haze. The new world stretched before them, vast, unpredictable, and full of possibilities that seemed impossible in England's rigidly structured society. Mrs. Blackwood, Edmund said, using the name Catherine would bear after their marriage ceremony, which they had planned to take place immediately upon reaching Virginia, are you prepared for a life that offers no guarantees except the ones we create for ourselves? Dar. Blackwood, she replied, her voice steady with conviction, I cannot imagine anything more appealing than building a life based on our own choices rather than inherited obligations. The ship entered Chesapeake Bay as afternoon light transformed the water into a mirror of gold and blue, carrying them toward a future where Edmund's medical skills would serve genuine need rather than aristocratic vanity, where Catherine's intelligence could flourish without artificial constraints, and where their love could grow in soil free from the poison of secrets and social pretense. Behind them lay England, a country they had loved despite its flaws, a society that had shaped them even as it had ultimately rejected them. Ahead lay Virginia and the promise of new beginnings, where a former duke's daughter and a physician's son could write their own story without reference to titles, bloodlines, or the elaborate deceptions that had defined their previous world. 3 months later, Edmund stood in the doorway of their modest but comfortable home outside Richmond, watching Catherine tend to the herb garden where she grew medicinal plants for his practice. She wore a simple blue dress that would have scandalized London society with its practical design, her hair arranged in a style that prioritized comfort over fashion, her hands bearing the honest calluses of someone who worked with her own tools rather than directing servants. She had never looked more beautiful to him. Their medical practice had grown rapidly as word spread through the community about the skilled physician and his remarkable wife who served anyone regardless of their ability to pay. Catherine had indeed established a school, teaching the children of farmers and merchants with the same dedication she had once applied to maintaining her social position in London's competitive aristocratic circles. Their marriage had been blessed with a happiness that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, built on the solid foundation of shared values, mutual respect, and the hard-won knowledge that love worth having required courage to defend and wisdom to nurture. Edmund, Catherine called from the garden, her voice carrying the contentment that had replaced the carefully modulated tones of her aristocratic past, Dr. Morrison is here to see you. He has news from England. Edmund looked up to see Colonel Morrison dismounting from his horse, the familiar figure now dressed in civilian clothes but still carrying the bearing that marked him as a man accustomed to authority. His presence in Virginia suggested developments in England that might affect their new life. Dr. Blackwood, Mrs. Blackwood, Morrison said, greeting them with genuine warmth, I hope you'll forgive my unannounced visit. I bring news that I thought you would want to hear personally. They gathered in their modest parlor, where Morrison accepted Catherine's offer of tea while organizing his thoughts about whatever information had brought him across the Atlantic. The investigation spawned by your father's revelations has concluded, he told Catherine directly. We've successfully dismantled the entire French intelligence network operating in London. More importantly, the government has recognized that Duke Ashworth's final cooperation was instrumental in protecting British interests. Catherine's eyes filled with tears at this confirmation that her father's death had indeed served a redemptive purpose. Additionally, Morrison continued, Parliament has voted to restore the Ashworth family honor posthumously. Your father's title will remain extinct, but the family name has been cleared of the taint of treason. You are welcome to return to England if you choose, with a substantial inheritance that the government has decided to restore. The offer hung in the air between them, a chance to reclaim the aristocratic life that Catherine had abandoned, to return to England with honor restored and financial security guaranteed. Edmund felt his heart stop as he waited for her response, knowing that he could never ask her to choose between her heritage and their life together. Catherine reached for Edmund's hand, her fingers intertwining with his as she looked directly at Colonel Morrison. Thank you for this information, Colonel. My father's redemption means more to me than I can express. But America is our home now. We have work to do here, a life we're building together, and a future that depends on our own efforts rather than inherited privilege. Morrison smiled, seeming unsurprised by her decision. I thought you might say that. The new world has a way of changing people's perspectives about what truly matters. After Morrison's departure, Edmund and Catherine stood together in their garden as evening settled over the Virginia countryside. The sounds of their adopted homeland surrounded them, night birds calling across the forests, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through tobacco fields that stretched toward the horizon. "Any regrets?" Edmund asked, echoing the question that had become their private ritual. "Only that it took a crisis to show us what we really wanted," Catherine replied, turning in his arms to face him directly. "We could have spent our entire lives in London, playing roles that slowly suffocated our souls." Edmund kissed her then, under the vast American sky that promised unlimited possibilities for those brave enough to claim them. Their story had begun with secrets and deception, evolved through moral crisis and difficult choices, and culminated in this moment of perfect understanding, two people who had found in each other the courage to build a life based on truth, love, and the radical proposition that happiness could be earned rather than inherited. The English aristocracy they had left behind would continue its elaborate dance of protocol and pretense, maintaining traditions that valued appearance over substance and birthright over character. But here in Virginia, Edmund and Catherine Blackwood would write their own story, a tale of love that had triumphed over social barriers, integrity that had survived moral compromise, and hope that had proved stronger than the weight of inherited shame. Their future stretched before them like the endless American frontier, uncertain but full of promise, challenging but rich with possibility, and theirs to shape according to the values they had discovered in each other during their darkest hours. The doctor who had known too much about nobility had finally learned the most important lesson of all, that true aristocracy lay not in bloodlines or titles, but in the courage to choose love over convention, truth over comfort, and hope over fear. As the stars emerged in the clear Virginia sky, Edmund and Catherine Blackwood stood together in their garden, their hands joined, their hearts united, and their future as bright as the dreams they had dared to pursue across an ocean and a lifetime away from the world that had tried to define them. Dr. Edmund Blackwood, now 52 and bearing the weathered hands of a man who had delivered hundreds of babies and healed countless injuries, stood in the doorway of the Blackwood Academy, watching his wife conduct the graduation ceremony for their latest class of students. Catherine, her golden hair now streaked with silver that only enhanced her beauty, addressed the young men and women who would soon depart for colleges and universities throughout America, carrying with them the education she had provided and the values she had instilled. Their 3 children, Theodore, Elizabeth, and James, sat in the front row, their proud faces reflecting the happiness that had defined their childhood in this place where love had proven stronger than any force that had tried to destroy it. Around them sat the families of their students, farmers and merchants, craftsmen and ministers, people whose dreams had been nurtured by the unlikely partnership of a former English aristocrat and a physician who had chosen conscience over comfort. The Blackwood name had become synonymous with healing and education throughout Virginia, carried by people whose accomplishments owed nothing to inherited privilege and everything to personal dedication and community support. It was a legacy built on the foundation of truth, service, and the radical proposition that character mattered more than birthright. As Catherine concluded her address with words about courage, integrity, and the responsibility that came with education, Edmund reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect fulfillment. They had lost a world of privilege and pretense, but they had gained something infinitely more valuable, a life of purpose, a marriage of equals, and the knowledge that their love had not only survived every test, but had grown stronger with each challenge they had faced together. The doctor who had known too much about nobility had finally discovered what truly mattered, not the secrets he could keep, but the truth he could live. And that truth was written in every smile that crossed Catherine's face, every student who left their academy prepared for life's challenges, and every patient who recovered under his care in this land where second chances were not just possible, but celebrated. Their story had ended not with the dramatic gestures beloved by poets, but with the quiet satisfaction of lives well lived, love honestly shared, and dreams courageously pursued. In leaving behind everything they had known, Edmund and Catherine Blackwood had found everything they had ever truly needed.